Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. I'm Alicia Cielle Heiser, an astrologer, herbalist, and witch living in Oregon on Kalapuya land, and I offer astrology consultations and teachings aimed at helping you honor your most authentic self and trust your intuition.
I'm Lori Kaufman, an astrologer, tarot reader, writer, and teacher. I co-lead the Asteroid Special Interest Research Group for NCGR, an astrology organization, and I offer all different sorts of readings, online and in person.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Conversations with the Planets. And today we're going to be giving a forecast and overview of what it means that Saturn is now in Aries and what we can all expect from Saturn's movement through Aries. And so to just start off with some key dates of how long this transit will last, Saturn just moved into Aries on May 25th of 2025, and it's doing a little preview this summer where it will be in Aries until September 1st of 2025. And then it will retrograde back into Pisces on September 1st and finish up the Saturn return for those of us who have Saturn in Pisces. And then right around Valentine's Day next year, depending on what part of the world you're in, but right, my ephemeris says on February 14th of 2026, Saturn will return to Aries and then will be there for good until April 13th of 2028. And we'll get into some other dates later on with like the Saturn Neptune conjunction and when Saturn talks to, Uranus and Pluto and some of the other really big outers through its movement. But that's just the general time that we can anticipate Saturn in Aries. And yeah, so just kind of digging in, should we talk about the significations of Aries first, Lori? Do you want to take that, Miss Aries chart
Yeah,
ruler?
Miss Aries. Yeah, so Aries is ruled by Mars, right? So I like to think of Aries as its movement, it's a little bit chaotic, it's fiery. But in general, Mars rules over things like violence and weapons and war.
And also
And
like our anger and motivation, like in more
yes,
personal lives for those of
in
us
more
who aren't
personal ways,
having
yes.
experiences with war on a daily basis.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and so yeah, internally it's going to show up more as your anger or your motivation even. It's not
hmm
always all negative. It can be your motives, how you act, how you move through the world, and the ways that you shift and move. And Aries is the external or the masculine version of Mars, whereas Scorpio is going to be the internal or the more feminine version of Mars. So I like to think of Aries as, it's cardinal fire. It's the
hmm
start of the spring. And so it really gives this like, it's the baby, it's the first sign, it's a newborn. So it's
hmm
going to do what it needs to do. I always like to think about Aries as a newborn baby. It's very primitive. And I like to think about like the significations of a baby, right? It eats, it sleeps, it poops, it it cries. But most importantly, it asks for help. And so like learning how to ask for help has always felt like a really big Aries signifier for me. And that's kind of how I teach it or talk to clients who have heavy Aries energy. It's like, where are you showing up? Where are you asking for help? Or where are you trying to do things completely your own? Or
hmm
almost this like it's independence, but I think it can also be like a toxic independence too, or like a hyper independence, being a little bit too much of a I can do this myself. I don't need anybody. I don't need any help. Which is admirable, but can also be very hard or
hmm
difficult.
For sure. Yeah, and Aries being a fire sign, like just really digging into the building blocks of how we make sense out of Aries is it
Hmm.
being ruled by Mars, it being a fire sign, and it being a cardinal sign that initiates a season. Like when the sun moves into Aries every year, that is the spring equinox in the beginning of spring. And fire signs are, they're really active and dynamic. They're very passionate. They're very purpose driven. We always say with people who have strong fire energy in their charts, like make sure you're getting enough regular physical movement. And definitely with Aries activation, like whether that's like angrily cleaning when you're overwhelmed or going on a walk or putting on your favorite song and dancing around your room, or like maybe actually doing very vigorous physical activity if that's something that feels good for you. Or like my friend who has a lot of Aries will just like shake their hands around angrily. But movement, like fire is a very dynamic, movable, extroverted, outgoing element. You look at the way fire moves and it moves upwards and outwards and has really ancient associations with divinity for that reason as well. And so Aries is kind of like the quest to find purpose type energy because it is that cardinal, which brings in this initiatory energy to the fire of like the fire going out to find its divine purpose.
Yeah.
And the cardinal energy also makes Aries very fast. All fire signs have some sort of fast energy to them, but Aries in particular, like initiating things, it's really good at getting stuff started, but it can get bored easily, have a short attention span. I liken it to the match. Like you light the match, like when you have that impulse, when you have that drive to do something, like do it now because you're gonna be bored in 5 minutes if you don't.
Yes.
And then another really important component of Aries is not only is it ruled by Mars, but the sun is also exalted there. And so looking at both the domicile lord as well as the exaltation lord of signs
Yes.
that have exaltation lords gives us a lot of the significations of how the ancients were thinking about these signs and how we can make sense out of them. And we have a whole episode about planets that are exalted, as well as planets in domicile. We also have an episode about planets in fall, which is relevant as we get into talking about Saturn and Aries, which is the place of Saturn's fall. So go check out our Essential Dignity series. But having the sun exalted in Aries brings this very regal leadership quality to Aries. Like both Mars and the sun have leadership significations, but especially the sun has been associated with royalty and CEOs. I mean, it has not been associated with CEOs across time. That would be a modern one, but
Right.
across time, it's been
Well, like
associated
kings, yeah.
kings, exactly, leaders. It can signify, Aries in medical astrology is the head. So it
Mhm.
can signify heads of state or just like people who are at the head of an organization or a group.
Absolutely.
Um,
It can be very literal too. I just want to add, like every
mhm,
single client I have, slash every person I know in general, including myself, has been complaining about brain fog, head injuries. I've seen a lot of like head injuries recently, or
mhm,
people hitting their heads, or just headaches in general. I just had a small staph infection in my nose.
mhm.
It's just been this constant influx. I've also felt and noticed a lot of like scatterbrainness or people feeling very foggy, which I think also is
It's the
Neptune.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's both. But like brain fog feels very Saturn and Neptune in Aries. And just a general like pressure. I've heard a lot of people complaining
Mm,
about feeling a lot of pressure in their head lately. So
that
if
makes
that's
sense.
something you relate to, especially if you have personal planets in Aries, that might be a reason why.
Yeah, and Aries also in medical astrology rules the adrenals and adrenalized states of being. And we'll get into that more later with talking about Saturn and Aries, but I'm an herbalist and I have some tips and pointers for avoiding burnout specifically, which is adrenal fatigue. And that's
Yes.
kind of the big warning of Saturn and Aries is burning yourself out. So care for your head, care for your adrenals. But yeah, the sun exalted in Aries does bring leadership significations. It brings like Aries is the place where we can find our identity and our sense of self and our personality because that fire like shines so brightly and independently. And that is the time when independence is good to like really know who you are. Um, yeah. Do you have any other things about Aries or the sun's exaltation, Lori?
No, I feel like that was a really good cover. I guess the last thing I will say is this is more of a personal opinion, but I've always thought of like the sun in Leo is like hey, I'm leading, I'm the king, come with me. But
Mm-hmm.
the sun in Aries is like, I'm doing it this way. If you want to come, come.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's the way that I kind of differentiate in my mind, like Aries and Leo, because they are very similar signs in a lot of ways too. But I feel like Leo is a little bit more like, hey, I want you to come with me. You're invited. But Aries is like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if you come with me. I'm doing this.
That makes
You're welcome
sense.
to join.
Yeah, because Aries is that match, it is that independence, it has that Mars, like Mars separates things.
Yes.
Whereas Leo, I always think of as the hearth fire and like it's fixed
Right.
fire. You constantly need to feed it, which is why Leo energy needs attention.
Right.
And it's like you're inviting everyone into the hearth. And then also Leo is fixed, so it has a bit more consistency and stability and really values integrity. Whereas not that Aries doesn't value integrity, but Aries definitely is not, like its gift is not consistency or stability by any
No.
means. It's good at getting
Yeah.
stuff going. That is really what Aries. So on
Yes.
a really
Well,
simple level, Saturn moving into Aries, hopefully you all have already started to feel things speeding up a little, especially in the Saturn areas of your life, in the areas ruled by Capricorn and Aquarius in your chart, as well as Aries, because Aries does get stuff going and it has that fire that just kind of like heats stuff up and gets movement going. Whereas Saturn in Pisces the past few years has been just, it's like the end of the zodiac, and Pisces just wants to take a bath and cuddle. So yeah, Aries will definitely speed stuff up when there's an Aries ingress.
yeah, yeah. So definitely looking at your own chart, what houses are ruled by Aries, and
Hmm.
just kind of seeing like what has sped up since you've moved into these changes, since the 24th of May when it moved.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I definitely feel like, especially like being ruled by Aries, being ruled by my Aries moon, I, when I talk to clients who also have heavy Aries energies, a piece of advice that I give a lot, that really worked for me too, is just kind of to lean into the impulses. And I
Hmm.
know I've talked about this a lot on here too, but it truly does help. Um, like a big rule I have for myself is that I eat only when I'm hungry or I sleep only when I'm tired, and I try to separate myself from the rules of society of how you're supposed to eat 3 meals a day and go to sleep at this time and wake up at this time. Like I've kind of separated myself from those things, and I try to just fully listen to my body, and I've noticed that those are not the routines that work for me, and sometimes every day is a little bit different.
Hmm.
So leaning into the consistencies and inconsistencies. And
Hmm.
sometimes, like, you go through a period of like hyperfixation, and you're gonna go through periods of like, oh, this is really exciting. Oh, I'm obsessed with this, to I actually don't want to touch that for 6 months.
Hmm.
And
Like your book.
like my book, yeah. And so you might notice that with projects.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a really good natural segue into like talking about Saturn in Aries in particular, because Saturn kind of struggles in Aries. It's not, Saturn's exalted in Libra, so it's in
Yeah, so it's
fall in
falling.
Aries. And one general way you can interpret when planets like don't have a lot of dignity in the chart is that it can lead to inconsistencies. Like I think I shared this example perhaps in the episodes about planets in fall, but I have a good friend whose Saturn is in Aries and it rules their IC, and they live part of the time in one country and part of the time in another country, and they have a very inconsistent like home foundation, which I think in a lot of ways they really love, and then I'm sure in some ways it's very dysregulating. But just in general, having those sorts of inconsistencies is one way you can make sense of Saturn and Aries, which was difficult for Saturn because Saturn likes things to be consistent.
Yep.
And then I'll also say, getting back to the burnout thing, that's a big thing to pay attention to as far as preventing burnout is assessing your energy every morning. Like if I make a long to-do list the day before and then I don't sleep well, I'm like, I can't do this. But then sometimes I wake up and I'm like, wow, I feel so motivated. I feel so great. Like I can get like half a week's work of work done like today, right? So assessing your energy every day. Spoon theory is a really good disability justice theory that can like kind of guide you in that. And then depending on how many spoons or like metaphorical energy you have that day, making your to-do list accordingly. And so that does mean when you are super motivated and you have that Aries energy, go for it. But it's also just as important when you're not feeling it, to give yourself rest and to let your body like really actually, especially if you have a really busy productive day or week where you're just super fixated, like to rest after that, because Saturn and Aries can just keep going and then burn itself out. So don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't do that. Great advice. It's always good to tell an Aries not to do something.
Yeah. Or do it, and then you'll be like, wow, Alicia did encourage me to not burn myself out. But
You have to learn yourself
Saturn,
sometimes.
yes, but Saturn is like, it deals with really big, long-term things, which is one reason it struggles in Aries, because Aries has quite a short attention span. And so, if you're like training for a marathon or doing something that's a really long-term endeavor, if you burn yourself out along the way and like really actually, like, you can get to the point where you've like overdrawn from your adrenals and you truly do not have the capacity in your body to continue the way you've been continuing. I think a lot of us are very familiar with that sort of sensation in modern life. And
Yeah.
then that can like actually, like, you can get sick, right? That's a lot of times we end up getting sick because our bodies are like, you have to stop. And then you spend your time resting, like feeling horrible and fighting off an illness, when you could have spent your time resting, not being sick, if you had, you know, thought ahead a bit more, which is the Saturn part of the lesson, is to
Yeah.
play the long game. Hey everyone, it's Alicia, and I am so excited to announce that I'm hosting a Moon Phases Wellness Retreat outside of Roseburg, Oregon on July 19th, 2025, in a beautiful natural setting right along the Umpqua River, where we will dig in depth into the moon phase you were born under and what that means for your personality and your emotional and physical needs, as well as how to work with the shifting moon phases in the sky to bring more magic and ritual into our daily experiences. We will also be blending our own tea blends and learning about different herbs and their magical and medicinal virtues and benefits. And there will be opportunities for yoga and ecstatic dance and journaling and engaging in group ritual. And so I really hope to see some of you there. All of the information for how to register is in the show notes down below.
And Saturn restricts, right? Saturn is all about slowing down, making sure you do it right the first time. It restricts, it makes things more difficult. So understanding those themes being mixed with Aries, like those are two things that don't necessarily get along or
Mm-mm.
belong together. And so that's going to be a really big thing to keep in mind as we go forward. I've been thinking a lot about Saturn moving into Aries because I have an early degree Aries moon. So it's obviously hitting me right now. And I have just been thinking about, like, well, what does that mean? And the image I keep getting is this like old serious teacher who's like trying to discipline a classroom of like bad students or like jocks
like
or like
or like, I feel like silly, like 6-year-olds who are just like
yeah, yeah,
silly
yeah,
little
yeah.
kids, like they just want to
Right.
play and like experience the
Right.
world and touch everything.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's just like this feels impossible. Like you kind of have to lean into the silliness a little bit. You
for
have to
sure.
play into it. And I've had a lot of experience with that teaching preschoolers. So,
Yeah, and like Saturn literally signifies old age, it rules elders, it brings maturity, and then Aries is the baby, right? So it is like a bit of a Benjamin Button. Or
yeah.
an example that Austin Coppock has used a lot of times is that there was a Saturn and Aries transit where a Chinese emperor like became emperor when he was like 2 years old. So he's given that like Aries like solar leadership position, but he's like literally a baby and completely not qualified to run an empire. So that can be like a Saturn and Aries type
Yeah.
experience as well, if any of you have your
It's
babies
very funny.
become rulers of nations.
Yeah, just in case of
That might,
maybe.
maybe that's relatable to
Yeah,
someone, who knows. But
right. That's a great thing.
um yeah, but Saturn, so Saturn rules old age, it rules maturity, it rules things that are like long-term projects,
hmm
things that take a long time to come to fruition. Oh, one thing I really wanted to say about Saturn is Nina Griffin gave this really great lecture at Norwalk 2025 about astrological magic with malefics in particular. And she was just talking about how it can be really helpful remediation to engage in intentionally Saturnian activities for difficult Saturn energy or intentionally Martian activities. And like Mars, I've said, I mean, I've already said that in this episode, even. I'm always telling people with lots of Mars activation to move their bodies, like having like intentional physical exercise, especially like not in
Yeah.
a way that hurts yourself, but like malefic energy is best channeled when it doesn't feel good, when you're not like particularly enjoying it. So Mars energy can be like strength training or like endurance training or like, moving your body in a way that's like hard for you personally, which is, different for all of us. And then
Right.
Saturnian energy and intentionally cultivating Saturnian energy is sitting in quiet solitude. And so that can be something that might be helpful for folks to consider integrating is some sort of like meditation contemplation practice. And again, not that you have to like sit on spikes or like make it painful, but like having it be kind of austere and serious and like, okay, I'm gonna like, especially in modern life with how much we love constant overstimulation, intentionally being like, I am going to really be in this kind of austere, quiet environment for this period of time and like put effort into like feeling Saturnian in that way,
Yeah.
can be good remediation and also practice for like, yeah, follow the impulses of Aries, but still like consider the Saturn stuff like, is this something that has long-term consequences and should I maybe
Right.
like take an extra beat just to think those through before I like sign a lease with this stranger or, whatever.
Yeah, yeah, and especially because I like to think of Saturn. Well, Saturn traditionally was seen, Kronos, he was seen with crutches and usually a giant gash in his leg, and he was the god of time. And so this was he represented this like wisdom that came from time, but not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily like it's also showing how it wears down your body, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
time is really good for the mind because you're learning, but it's not great for the body because it falls apart eventually. And so he had a lot to do with like just the wisdom of age. And Aries is kind of like the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it doesn't really learn lessons from age. It's learning lessons from doing it for the very first time and doing something new each time. Whereas maybe a Saturn ruled person or a Saturn or Aquarius or Capricorn or a heavy Saturn person in general, um, they might do something once and be like, well, that was terrible. I'm not doing this again. They might learn their lesson, or they might stick to a routine because, hey, that works, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I've seen this be tried and true. But somebody like Mars ruled, somebody with a lot of Aries energy is kind of going to be the opposite. They're going to want constant change and they're going to want to shake things up and they're going to want new, different, exciting, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Yeah. And honoring the basic psychological needs of Aries, of needing and wanting that. And so, like, yeah, you can have your like 20 minutes of Saturnian austerity and like, rethink major long-term decisions you're making. And there's still a time and a place to be a bit more like maybe Aquarius Saturn about things, even with Saturn and Aries.
Mhm.
But Saturn and Aries does have the basic psychological need of like that newness and that freshness and like going with their motivation and inspiration and like honor that. If you try to suppress it too much, then it's gonna express itself anyway. And it's better if you have a bit more of a say in how it expresses itself or attempt to have a say because, do we fate versus free will? How much do we have of either? Big question.
Exactly.
But
Yeah.
and then yeah, like we keep mentioning Saturn's in fall in Aries, so it's a difficult place for Saturn and the essential dignity scheme. This can lead to inconsistencies. This means that Saturn really struggles with like reputation and visibility. So Saturn and Aries can really feel like, man, I'm like working so hard. Because like that's the gift of malefics is like being able to work very hard. And when you put a malefic in a malefic ruled sign, like I know a lot of Saturn and Aries people. I actually am thinking of two specific Saturn and Aries people who are Capricorn risings, who are just like incredible business people and like so hardworking and they're just out there grinding all the time. But because it's fallen, you might feel like you're not like appreciated or lifted up as much as you might appreciate. Like Aries, like the sun's exalted there. Like Aries loves to be like lifted up and seen and appreciated, and Saturn
Mhm.
has to deal with like darkness and like a lot of things, it's like the masses and like the laboring class is also ruled by Saturn, right? And so it's like struggling with feeling seen or appreciated for the Saturnian type of things you put out in the world can be something for people with Saturn and Aries, and then something we all will be experiencing more during this transit. And then also planets in fall, to quote Austin Coppock again, he's always talking about how like fall versus detriment are two different dignity things. Detriment is when a planet is in a sign opposite from a sign that it rules. So when Saturn's in Cancer or Leo, it's opposite Capricorn and Aquarius, so it's like very far from its home. And
Yeah.
that can signify a lack of resources. But when a
Hmm.
planet's in fall, that means that they're opposite their sign of exaltation. So if Saturn's lifted up and given that visibility and reputation in Libra, that's why the lack of visibility is an issue when it's in fall. But it's also the way Austin talks about it is the place of a planet's fall is like there's a trap that this planet always falls into. And if you can figure out what that trap is and figure out ways to work with it and work around it, I mean, not to say anything's better or worse, but it seems like there's ways that you can be more constructive with a planet in fall rather than a planet in detriment that just is like very under resourced. And I feel like the trap for Saturn and Aries is like the impulsiveness of, long-term projects. Like if you're rushing
Right.
construction on something and then you build the foundation poorly. Yeah, what do you think about that? Like, what do you think the trap is for Saturn and Aries?
Oh. I mean, probably that, just like doing something too quickly and then looking back later and being like, that's not how I would do it now.
Hmm.
Actually a conversation I've been having with myself constantly about the book too. Um, it's because it's taking me so long to go through and edit each individual character. And there's a part of me that's like, I could just speed this up. Like, I usually just go really fast. I could just speed this up. And then I'm like, no, but I want this to be perfect. And
Hmm.
it's not going to be perfect if I speed it up because then I'm going to miss things. I usually do. I miss things. And so I'm trying to like not do that this time, which has been very interesting to learn the opposite side. And I like to think of fallen planets too as like a fall from grace. So there might be
Hmm.
a moment where you're at the top and you're like being put on that pedestal, but then you fall off of it
Hmm.
and you start to feel like people are actually seeing you, um, maybe in a way you didn't want to be seen, or maybe for something that you rushed, or maybe something you did too quickly or didn't put
Hmm.
that thought into. And so I think that could be another way that that manifests.
Well, especially Saturn and Aries can also lead to conflict because Aries is conflict. And I feel like Saturn and Aries can really be like setting your boundaries way too quickly or just like putting up those kind of Saturnian no's in an aggressive Aries way.
Yeah.
And yeah, when you're exalted, it's a long way to fall from the top. So that's definitely
Yeah.
what fallen planets can feel like.
Right.
And then also, and we talk about this both in our detriment and planets in fall episode, but like planets when they don't have a lot of dignity can be like so beautiful and so amazing and super countercultural, right? Because planets with a lot of dignity, essentially what that means is they're functioning in ways that are congruent with the society they're in. And there's
Hmm.
times when it's good to be functioning in ways that are congruent with your society. Then there's times when your society is like really racist and misogynistic and homophobic, and like you don't want to be just like going with the status flow. And
Right.
so Saturn and Aries can definitely be like a challenge to the status quo. It can be, depending on what planets, like I have a Saturn ruled fifth house and I don't have Saturn in Aries, but like that could be like a queer experience, for example, to have like a fallen Saturn ruling your fifth house, or you could just be more unconventional in your work if it's a Saturn ruled MC, or just ways where you don't like you're outside of the norm of society, which a lot of times other people will then punish you for and can be a difficult experience. But you might and hopefully do like really love the, unique countercultural ways that like if you have Saturn and Aries or another fallen or detriment
Right.
planet, like they can show up in really, really cool ways. And Saturn and Aries in particular can be a pretty revolutionary energy of like
Yeah.
challenging. Like it's like Aries represents the leaders and the heads of state, and Saturn's opposite the sun for a reason. Like Leo and Aquarius oppose each other, and so having this fallen Saturn can definitely, like, I feel like all of the anti-ice protests that have been happening around the country, and within 2 weeks of Saturn moving into Aries, my social media is just full of like cop cars on fire. I feel like that's
Yeah.
like a very
That's
literal
so
Saturn in
literal.
Aries. Um,
Well, and the protest was literally called No Kings, which
yes,
feels
literally.
very
Yeah, the
fallen
anti-Trump stuff.
Saturn and Aries.
Totally.
Yeah,
So,
I thought that was
sometimes,
too.
yeah, like Alia Lumi gave a really good lecture. Norwalk was recent, so we've been quoting a lot of them. But
Yeah.
he was talking about eclipses specifically,
Yes.
but how eclipses can be really scary for people in power, but actually can be a great opportunity for those of us who
Yeah.
are harmed by those in power. And I
Right.
feel kind of similarly about Saturn and Aries. It can also be people in power acting in very Saturnian ways and like closing their
Yeah.
fists and authoritarianism on the other end of the extreme. But then authoritarianism leads to resistance, leads to revolution. So it's a whole
Yeah.
conversation.
And this is partially unrelated, but kind of related. But I was thinking about this morning and actually writing about this, so I'm just gonna say it. But I think it's interesting that Saturn moved into Aries just a few months after the North Node moved out of Aries. So we shifted away from
Hmm.
having eclipses in the Aries axis into having Saturn now be there. And then they switched places, right? Because the North Node moved into Pisces, and then the Saturn moved out of Pisces.
Hmm.
And I was doing some editing this morning for the Amazon asteroid, which represents the Amazon women, the warrior women, and it was talking a lot about how they don't fit in, and often they were just women who band together and like sometimes fought men, sometimes killed the men that showed up in their space, but they were seen as unattractive to the men so that they built their own community, they built their own space. And so they represent this like race or community of women who fought against these norms. And I
Mm.
was thinking, like, how interesting is it that this feels very Saturn and Aries? Like, we were about to talk about this, and that's what I'm editing this morning. And it just
Hmm.
felt like it was like the feminine version of Aries. And so I looked at where the Amazon asteroid is transit wise, and it's actually moving towards the North Node as we speak. And
Mm.
so that was something I was kind of thinking about is like with that asteroid being in Pisces right now and it's moving towards the North Node, are we going to have this increase, especially around eclipse season? Probably the Virgo eclipse even, but like or the Virgo season eclipses cycle, whatever. Are we going to have this increase of people starting to shift and women starting to really lean into this energy because it's showing up in several different ways now, especially with that
Hmm.
asteroid moving too, because it all feels like it's reiterating the same few points, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. It's like stories and thread lines that continue. And, thinking of how the eclipses in the Aries Libra axis impacted you personally since what
Yeah.
was that, like the fall of 2023 when those eclipses started?
Yeah.
And then now Saturn might be picking up different threads of that story or similar threads of that story and might continue that
Yeah.
story in more of a Saturnian way rather than an eclipsy way, which again,
Yeah.
Saturn brings longevity. It
Yeah.
tries to bring stability. I don't know how good Saturn and Aries is at bringing stability, but Saturn,
Yeah.
can kind of make things more concrete or long lasting. It can also bring consequences if you're not like doing what you should. Saturn rules like rules and regulations,
Yeah.
and the consequences of not following those. Um, and yeah, Saturn
Yeah.
like cools things off. Again, in Aries, this is why they're incongruent, but Saturn likes to
Yeah.
kind of like slow things down or make things like cooler, more structured. So yeah, you can think about that for your
Yeah.
personal life.
For sure. I also thought it was interesting because like with the Amazons again. the name literally translates into single-breasted, and they would chop off one of their boobs so that they could hold their weapons easier because otherwise the breast
They're
would be in the way. And so they didn't like that. And so they would just chop it off. And I was like,
oh.
that's such an Aries thing to do, is
Mm-hmm.
just to be like, actually, this piece of my body is in the way from me using my weapon. I'm going to just chop it off and not have to
Mm-hmm.
deal with it anymore. And they would only do the one that was on the side of their dominant arm. Um, and so it was like getting rid of something you don't need in order to have the space for um weapons, having
Yeah,
this
for sure. Like
to
whatever
fight,
your
basically,
symbolic or
whatever.
literal weapons are. Yeah, and
Yeah,
that can definitely be a good general Saturn and Aries interpretation is like, or
yeah,
advice for it is like, get rid of the things you don't need in that area of your life,
right.
in your Aries area in particular, to make room for other things. And then also that example is just making me think of like trans healthcare and top surgery and like the war on trans healthcare that's happening in the United States as well.
Yeah,
Do you know
because
what the, oh, go
Chris
ahead.
Brennan, real quick, just did a episode on I think trans or queer. I I didn't actually watch it, but I saw it pop up and I saw a few clips from it. But he did an episode on the history of Venus being in Aries.
Mm-hmm.
Venus retrogrades in Aries, sorry. And it's coinciding with like different queer or trans movements or like them being ostracized or things happening to queer people, and how this recent one has had a lot to do with everybody turning on trans people again. And I think that's kind of interesting because like we
Mm-hmm.
just had that retrograde and now we're moving into Saturn being there to kind of like solidify whatever was just there. So it feels like
Mm-hmm.
these themes are showing up.
They're all being tied together. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
they're
been so much
together.
activation in early Aries because we had that simultaneous Venus and Mercury retrograde in early Aries over the spring. And then Neptune just moved into Aries, which we'll talk a bit more about a little later on when we talk about the Saturn Neptune conjunction. And then Saturn's in Aries. And then the eclipses just finished in Aries. So, yeah, there's been a lot of activation for sure. Should we talk a little about like who Saturn and Aries would be the most impactful for, like what to look for in your chart?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this might be the start of your Saturn return. If you were born between April 7th of 1996 and June 9th of 1998, or if you were born between October 25th of 1998 and March 1st of 1999, then this is your first Saturn return. And I apologize to the folks who this is their second Saturn return. I did not actually pull the dates. It would have been like the
Oh, I
late
have them.
60s, yeah, of the last time Saturn was in Aries before the 90s, because Saturn is
Yeah.
in a sign about every 29 years it returns to the sign. So yeah, do you have
Yeah,
the
so
60s dates?
March, yeah, it was March of 1967 until April of 1969. And it looks like from this, it didn't retrograde
Okay.
back.
Yeah, sometimes it's just like one full hit.
Yeah,
Sometimes
sometimes
like
it just
this
hits. Yeah.
time, it enters Aries for the summer of 2025, goes back to Pisces in the fall, and then enters Aries for good. So depending on where Saturn's retrogrades are. But if you were born during those dates in the 1960s or 1990s, you are in your Saturn return. Um, and Lori and I are going to do a whole episode about how to interpret Saturn returns. So definitely check that out.
Yeah.
But that's something to look for if you're literally in your Saturn return. If you have Saturn in any of the cardinal signs, so Aries, Cancer, Libra, or Capricorn, then you are either in your Saturn return, Saturn square, or Saturn opposition,
Yeah.
which I feel
Which
like
is a big
Saturn.
Saturn cycle also.
Yes, every 7 years, it's not just your Saturn return. Every 7 years, you have a big activation around Saturn and for cardinal Saturns. So, like, if you are a Saturn and Capricorn individual, things will
Yeah.
now come to fruition around events that occurred during your Saturn return in Capricorn, for example.
Yeah, and actually that's something I talk about a lot is I feel like people finish up their Saturn return and then they're like, "Phew, I'm over it. Like it's done. That's it." And then they turn 36, 37, and they get slammed by their first Saturn square, or their second Saturn square, but the first Saturn cycle since their Saturn return. And nobody really sees it coming unless you are an astrologer, unless you do know these things and you know to
Hmm.
prep for it. But and there's a couple other things that happen around 36, 37 that make the astrology really interesting. It's your nodal return, your second nodal return since you're 18.
Hmm.
There's a couple other things too that make it important, but it just really shows up as like a big year for a lot of people, maybe one of the most difficult years. And it tends to mirror whatever happened when you were 7 years old. And so looking at Saturn cycles, because you get hit when you're about seven, and then 14, and then 21, and then 29. So then as you move into the next phase, and that's give or take a year too for each
Yeah.
age.
Each
Um,
person, it would be specific based off of your birth chart, but around then.
exactly. Around those years. But then as you move into the next phase, um, then when you're 36 and then 42, I believe, and then so
Hmm.
on, you're going to start experiencing repeats of these old patterns. And if you didn't deal with it the first time, you might notice that these old themes show back up. And so Saturn cycles are so important to dive into, and especially if you are entering, if you're 36, 37 right now and you're entering your Saturn square, that's going to be particularly strange because you have a very happy Saturn in domicile, and then having it square in Aries where it's very unhappy is going to feel very polarizing.
Hmm. For sure. And, Saturn ages like fine wine. So hopefully and ideally, Lori and I are both too young to speak to this, but I feel like a lot of elder astrologers tend to say that they tend to see Saturn experiences are like not quite as acute or like painful or as extreme as you get older, generally because you
Yeah.
hopefully learn the lessons that Saturn's like that
Right.
really strict teacher that like makes you do your homework every night and like hits your hand
Right.
with a ruler when you don't. And then you're like, oh, wait, I actually know geometry so well because I had to do all of those drills that I hated.
Right. And not
So
everybody learns the lesson though, so that's important to remember
no,
too.
yeah, but that can be advice for Saturn is,
Yeah.
what lessons is she trying to teach you? Sometimes you're like, I just really don't want to pay my taxes, but you have to because like you're in a world where, that's just like Saturn's like these external structures and realities that we have to contend with, whether we like them or not. And sometimes, Saturn and Aries can be very well poised to push back and challenge when those are like arbitrary and unnecessary. And sometimes we can change them, especially when
Mhm.
they're unjust. And then sometimes you can't, and then so it's just like picking your battles.
Yeah.
But so hopefully Saturn, sometimes it does get better as you get older if you are dealing with Saturn's problems, because Saturn problems like they don't go away. Like they're chronic. It's Chronos, it's chronic. So it's like Mars stuff, sometimes you can get away with just being like, I'm not going to deal with that. And sometimes it does just go away. Saturn stuff, like it'll come back up, and especially during the squares. And then the other nuance to consider there is if you were born during the daytime, Saturn might not be
Right.
quite as harsh to you, whereas those of us born at nighttime, and we have a whole episode about sect in astrology and that theory, which is such a great theory to work with. But I mean, like Lori and like once my Saturn return in Pisces is done, maybe we can do an episode really talking about like our different Saturn returns, and like hers is in Aquarius,
Yeah.
mine's in Pisces. We both have dark house Saturns, but her Saturn return was definitely a lot less acutely painful than mine, and she does have a day chart, and I have a night chart. So that can be something, if you have a day chart, your Saturn stuff in it, like it might not be as hard, and if you have a night chart, you might want to like really like
Buckle down.
prepare, yeah, yeah, bunker down for some harshness. But um and then Saturn can bring like great rewards for effort as well. I feel like we're always like, oh no, your
Yeah.
Saturn return, or like Saturn's so difficult, or like Lori even said like for some people in their mid 30s it can be the hardest year of their life, and like that can be true. But also like Lori, like didn't you love your Saturn return? Like do you want to speak a
Yeah.
little bit to how Saturn can like strangely feel good too?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, 29 was maybe the best, if not one of the best, years of my life because I finally felt like I knew what I was doing. I finally felt like it was the first time that I was in a really good flow. I knew what I wanted. I started to make stronger decisions and set better boundaries. I had always wanted to travel, but I was always kind of taught that travel wasn't really like worth your time and money and effort and whatever. So that was the first time I finally set boundaries and said, actually, I want to travel for fun, not just for work or for conferences or whatever I had been traveling for in the past. But I finally was like, actually, I just want to go to Europe for a
Hmm.
couple weeks, and that's okay. And so this was like kind of the first time that I started to set better boundaries and I started to um, really learn what I wanted and what I needed. Um, and there were a couple times where I was kind of forced into slowing down, and I do talk a lot about how I know I've told my Saturn return story a couple times on here, but I think the biggest lesson I learned was like if you slow down and actually do it right, then you can gain rewards from
Hmm.
the work that you put into it, and things will get significantly easier. Whereas if you fight it, you won't. And I started having these really crazy dreams around then that I was gonna hurt myself in acro, and it like made me not want to push my body in the way that I used to push my body. And it really made me slow down and be a lot more intentional about the things that I was working on and the things that I didn't want to do anymore. And I started to tell people no, and I stopped working on certain more dangerous skills because they didn't feel right in my body anymore. And I was really scared of hurting myself because I was getting older. Um, and I think that really helped me with longevity with it too, because I do sometimes wonder if that was some sort of premonition that stopped me from really hurting myself. And so being able to slow down, I think, and listen in those moments instead of pushing yourself can be a really good lesson as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Um, yeah, so Saturn's not all bad. But yeah, so if you have Saturn in Aries or any of the cardinal signs, this will be a particularly activating transit for you. And then if you have any other planets in Aries or any of the cardinal signs, it will also be particularly activating because Saturn will conjoin any of your planets that you have in Aries and it will square or oppose any of your other cardinal planets. And the squares and oppositions are like the more tense dynamic ones, so that's why we would like really pay attention to them. But yeah, Lori and I both offer astrology readings. So if you want to dig into how this is really activating for you, our stuff is down below for that. But just to give you an idea of what to look for if this transit is going to be like particularly activating for you. And then as far as how to interpret how this will show up for you, we mentioned looking at the houses that are ruled by Capricorn and Aquarius for you and what life topics those are will give you a big clue as to what Saturn and Aries is doing in your life. We'll be releasing some episodes in a few weeks about how to work with the houses in astrology, and I have a blog post down below, linked down below, about how to work with this technique if that's a newer technique for you. But like for example, Saturn rules my fourth house and my IC, and I'm in the process of moving right now. So that could be like a very literal, um, Saturn and Aries type transit. We get really used to Saturn being in the same sign. It's been in Pisces since March of 2023. So then when Saturn changes signs and like this different energy comes into our Saturn ruled areas of our life, we're like, oh, it's an adjustment. And then also paying attention to the life topics ruled by Aries for you. So I'm in the process of like really establishing a very long-term relationship and I have an Aries descendant. So those are things to look for. And I had another thought and it just like flew out of my mind. Do you have anything to contribute, Lori?
Yeah, I do want to go backwards real quick and mention that your Saturn return, if you do have Saturn in Aries natally, is not going to be the entire time that Saturn is in Aries. You do want to pay attention to the degrees.
Hmm.
So if you have a 29-degree Saturn in Aries, then you're technically not going to hit your Saturn return, your exact hit, for a couple years.
Hmm.
So you have a little while. I just had a client come to me a couple days ago. She's like, I'm starting my Saturn return. And she's like, I need some dates, I need some advice. And we sat down and she had like a 28-degree Saturn. And I was like, your Saturn return's not even till like 2028. Like,
Hmm.
you're
Although
okay.
I will say, and maybe we like honestly pinpoint this and come back for our Saturn return
Yeah.
episode, because I also kind of disagree that like as long
Mhm.
as you have this whole sign, like as long as Saturn's in Aries, it's activating your
Yes.
Saturn in Aries. So
Yes.
you most likely will have the loudest stuff happen with the exact degree return, but
Yes.
not always. So it
Yeah.
is important for everyone with Saturn in Aries. But yes, the exact degree, personally, that was when my Saturn return was the loudest. It was like when I got knee
Yeah.
surgery,
Right.
which is so Saturnian. But
Yeah, I definitely think you start to feel shifts when it moves into the sign, but you want to definitely pay attention to when it's 10 degrees away, to when it's 5
mhm,
degrees away,
yeah,
to when it's 1 degree away, and then to the day of the exact hit, because those are going to be where most of your stories come from. Whereas now, like, yes, if you have a late degree Saturn in Aries, you are going to start to feel the shifts. Like, those themes are starting to come up, and you might, like, start to see certain things show up for you. But your actual Saturn hit is going to be in a little while. So you can kind of rest and breathe and just feel out how this feels now before you actually get into that within 10-degree mark of actually having your
yeah.
Saturn return.
I think we should dig into this next because I'm like, I still
Yeah.
disagree that there are some instances where someone with a late degree Saturn in Aries might have like a really acute Saturn in Aries return thing happen now that
Yeah.
then might come to fruition. But it's not like there's so much nuance. But I do agree generally like the exact degree tends to be louder, but not always. Um, and then the other thing, just for all of us, is that because Saturn is in Aries in the summer of 2025 from May 25th to September 1st, this is a preview for us all to see what Saturn has in store for the next 3 years, which is where I'm like, yeah, some people might have some like really big Saturn stuff happen, even if their Saturn is really late. And then that can give you a warning of, okay, if you know Saturn's coming to like your 28-degree Saturn, and something big happens this year, then like what can you do to prepare for when that might like really be reactivated in 2028?
Yeah.
Um, but for all of us, just paying attention to world events, paying attention to what's shifting in our lives, because then we'll get a break from Saturn and Aries this fall. And then, like, Saturn loves when you prepare and you think ahead. And so, paying attention to what's happening now is this little preview. And if you don't like how it goes this summer, like, how can you work? That's where, like, the fate versus free will conversation comes in, is like, we're all walking through this environment, like the astro weather of like Aries fireballs coming down at us, but like you can choose what you're wearing or where you walk, or you can choose how you interact with that environment. So if there's things coming up, don't ignore them, and just like really kind of plan through knowing the timeline of like this energy will be present
Yeah.
until April 13th of 2028 is when Saturn moves into Taurus.
Yeah. Cool.
And then the other thing to really pay attention to while Saturn is in Aries is what Mars is doing, because Mars rules Aries. And so, paying attention to the dignity of Mars, Mars changes signs every 2 or so months. So, I didn't pull dates for like really good or bad Mars times, but like when Mars is in Scorpio, Capricorn, or Aries, that can be particularly supportive for
Hmm.
the Aries topics, although like a Mars Saturn conjunction in Aries also sounds very difficult and unpleasant for those of us with like
Yeah.
physical bodies. But like if you're
Sounds
writing a
super fun.
book or training for like the like MMA or something, like it might be a really productive time.
Yeah.
Um, but when Mars has more dignity, that is more resourcing for Saturn. And then when Mars is in Libra or Cancer or Leo, wait, not, sorry, those are Saturns. Libra or Cancer or Taurus, those will be potentially very difficult, especially Mars and Libra opposing Saturn and Aries, because that's where Mars has less dignity. And then we just finished a Mars retrograde, but we will have another Mars retrograde while Saturn is in Aries, and that will also be particularly activating. Mars retrogrades like really, it's when Mars is just like in the sky, bright red all night. So it's like this really strong, concentrated Mars energy that can come through in kind of distorted or extreme ways, which can be like excess conflict, excess frustration, excess violence globally, especially. It can be like
Mhm.
an excess of Mars or like this really uncontrolled, like just way that Mars comes through can be how Mars retrogrades feel, which can then be particularly hard for the Saturn and Aries transit we're all going through.
Yeah.
And so that will be January to April of 2027 in Virgo and Leo, where Mars will retrograde again. And so it stations retrograde on January 9th, 2027 at 10 degrees Virgo, goes all the way back to 20 degrees Leo, and stations direct on April 1st of 2027. So that'll be a really key time to watch out for. And yeah, like maybe train for the MMA or something. But if you don't have some like really malefic stuff to work on, maybe allow yourself to kind of like bunker down and not expect too much from yourself in the beginning of 2027.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. And then I also have the Saturn retrograde dates, which Saturn, so retrogrades are really significant when it's Mercury, Mars, and Venus because they don't spend as much time retrograde. Like Mars and Venus both retrograde every 2 or so years, and then Mercury spends about 3 years, 3 times a year, 3 weeks, 3 times a year retrograde. So those are the ones that are really significant. And then when you get to like Jupiter through the outer planets being retrograde, most of them spend about half a year retrograde. So we get more used to that energy, but particularly around the stations. Like I think it was Mars stationing either retrograde or direct in Pisces a few years ago when that submarine of billionaires got crushed by the ocean, which is just like
Yeah.
so Saturn and Pisces. So
Yeah.
the stations in particular can really kind of amplify because that's like Saturn in the same degree in the sky for an extended period of time. And then again, retrogrades can just kind of distort energy. They can cause you to reconsider, rethink, revise, redo, all the rewords. Um, but Saturn stations retrograde at 1 Aries on July 12th of 2025, and then stations direct at 25 Pisces on November 27th of 2025. And then we have Saturn retrograding next summer, stations retrograde at 14 degrees of Aries on July 25th of 2026. So if you have any points or planets near 14 degrees of any of the cardinal signs, that is particularly significant for you because that's an extended Saturn transit where it's retrograding. And then it stations direct on December 9th of 2026 at 7 Aries. So if you have any points or planets at that degree, that's also particularly important to keep an eye on or near that degree. And then the third retrograde is stationing retrograde on August 8th of 2027 at 27 Aries, and then stationing direct on like right before Christmas on December 23rd of 2027 at 21 Aries. So paying attention to those dates and those points in the sky might be when times like things feel particularly activated around the Saturn and Aries transit.
Yeah. Cool.
Cool. The other stuff I had prepared was talking about like the Saturn Neptune conjunction. Do you want to dig
Yeah.
into that, or do you have anything to add before we kind of go down that rabbit hole?
I have a lot of like really interesting things I've found about the history of
Yeah.
last times, well, other times, I guess, that Saturn has been in Aries, and I've just been thinking about this a lot as an Aries ruled person. I've just
Mm-hmm.
been trying to dive a little deeper into what is this going to mean and what has it meant in the past. Um, so some big things that I've actually found, um, the whole DIY thing actually started during Saturn and Aries.
Hmm.
Not the last one, but the one before that. And so in the 60s. And it was just like there was a whole boom of people trying to teach themselves how to do things. And I feel like that kind of came back around in the like late 90s because that was when the internet was kind of getting launched, or like really starting to take off, which I'll come back to that. And I feel like every other thing I see on TikTok now is starting to become DIY things again.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been feeling like Pluto and Aquarius in general, and then Uranus moving into Gemini. I mean, this could be its own talk. This could be a whole episode. But I think that trine is just going to bring so much technology and so much
Hmm.
advancement so fast and so much communication. I'm wondering if people are going to start really wanting to go backwards. And I've been talking to some of my friends recently about starting a homestead, buying a big plot of land, and everybody building their own house and sharing a big community building, but separate living spaces, but separate
Hmm.
but together, basically, is kind of that. Um, as I've been starting to tell people about these plans and starting to like kind of share what I want and be a little more open about things like that because that's something I've wanted for a long time but never really talked about. I'm starting to realize that's kind of what everybody wants. And
Yeah.
everyone I talk to is really like, oh, I want to do that too. And like, this is something I really want. And I was like, well, that is very Pluto and Aquarius, but I wonder if that trine to Uranus and then the sextile to Saturn and Aries is going to be like, I actually don't want to be part of this. I'm going to start my own thing. And, just in general, being a person that has so much Aquarius and Aries in general, like that is how I feel all the time. It's like, I
Yeah.
actually don't want to do what you're doing. I want
Yeah.
to do it this way.
Hmm.
And so like starting something totally fresh and totally new, especially with that like whole DIY
Hmm.
thing, I feel like it all kind of intertwines. I'm trying to say too many words at the same
Interweaves, intertwines.
interweaves. Yes. I think they all kind of filter into each other.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, there's going to be like huge transformation when it comes to those things. Hi everyone, I'm Lori, and I offer readings of any kind. I do astrology, tarot, and palm readings. And I focus on all different sorts of timing techniques and can basically help you answer any questions you might have. I also recently started a Substack to go along with my book I've been writing on the asteroids and astrology. And so I've been posting all of the fun stories in there. And so if you're interested in asteroids and watching them play out in your chart, or using them to interpret. I've been posting all sorts of fun stories in there, and you can go find that on my website. It's on my Instagram, which is linked below, and anywhere else.
That also makes me think of just like the prepper movements and people like
Yes.
thinking more about prepping. And there's like
Yes.
extremes
Right.
of that. And
Exactly.
then there's also like we all lived through 2020 and like supply chains are not guaranteed to be there. So having, and Saturn and Aries can be like the fall of kings and the fall of structures, and whatnot. And especially Pluto and Aquarius over the next 20 years is like these big revolutionary changes. And so just being prepared for like if Saturnian structures that you're used to being in place might not always be in place, especially with a fallen Saturn, and like what
Right.
do you need to be able to like take care of yourself and your family. But don't buy a bunch of beans and let them rot in your garage. I see so many people do that, and I'm like, if you're gonna like prep food, like have a way to rotate it and eat it. And
Right.
like, you know, everyone should go
Right.
read
For
Parable
sure.
of the Sower by Octavia Butler as well.
Mhm.
Especially with Uranus moving into Gemini, we got to get good at being with change. But
Yeah.
yeah, like
Right.
prepping, DIY, that makes a lot of
Yeah.
sense. Independent movements, countercultural
Yeah.
movements in general.
hmm And then, yeah, the next thing I really found was that so the internet was founded or created or started during Saturn in Aquarius.
In
Um,
Aquarius or
mhm,
okay.
yeah, the internet.
Okay.
And so that was something I thought about a lot when Saturn was back in Aquarius, when I was having my Saturn return, because I knew I was about a little bit older than the internet. And so that was starting to come up as like oh, well, here's the internet having its Saturn return. COVID happened and now everything is being moved online. But I just found was that Google was launched during Saturn and Aries.
Mm-hmm.
And that created like a bigger boom of the internet. So like the internet was created and founded, but then it took like 3, 4 years before people started to truly use it. And that's when like Google and Amazon and like all of those bigger companies had started, but really started to take over the tech industry and people started to actually really use the internet
Hmm.
during Saturn and Aries because it existed from Saturn and Aquarius, but I think it was more so like from what I'm understanding, it didn't sound like people really used it until Saturn moved
Hmm.
into Aries, or it wasn't really the what it became or what it has become, I guess, until then.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so that was an interesting thought.
And I feel like you already mentioned, Pluto recently moved into Aquarius, and then Uranus is about to move into Gemini. It might be in Gemini by
Hmm.
the time this episode's released, actually.
Right.
And I do have a couple dates for when Saturn sextiles each of those. And I think,
Cool.
when the outer planets and the slower moving planets talk to each other, they can really speak to big generational shifts because they're all very slow
Yes.
moving planets. So they like touch on these big generational shifts we're all experiencing,
Yeah.
and really like the TLDR of just like this explosion and speeding up of technology that like Pluto and Aquarius is really lined up with the development of AI, and with Uranus
Right.
moving into Gemini, it's just gonna like blow it
Yeah.
up and blow it out and
Mhm.
like bring that all out. And then Saturn sextiling both of them is just kind of like bringing this kind of structural like long term stuff there, but then also
Integrating
like
it.
but then the difficulties of like, well, where does like government or structures play a role in regulating big tech companies? And like, I mean, right now the way big tech companies are just like these giant monopolies that have like very predatory like approaches to like the climate and people, and like they're not, they're run by like a couple billionaires who like my values don't really align with. I don't think most of us are like, yes, like people have a weird thing with Elon Musk. He's also like his political views are actually like very disturbing as far as like human rights and stuff. We don't need to get into the politics of all of this, but like I personally don't want like major life decisions made by like a few people at the top, which can be a very like distorted Aries thing, right? And so there's
Right.
like these sorts of conversations have been going on and are going to be like blown up and really activated by these transits.
Yeah.
And so Saturn only sextiles Pluto once, and that's in March of 2026 at 5 degrees of Aries and Aquarius. So that can bring up some of the activation around these like tech and power structures and governments and how this impacts us in the long term. And then Saturn sextiles Uranus 3 times in March and April. Most of them are in Pisces and Taurus, though, which is interesting. So it's also kind of
Hmm.
like they're both moving back and forth between
Yeah.
their like old and new signs, and we're like moving into this new world order, but like we haven't fully left the like
Yeah.
old world structures. And so the first sextile was in March and April of 2025, where Saturn was at 24 Pisces and Uranus was at 24 Taurus. We'll have another sextile this August where they're both at 1 Aries and Gemini. And then the last sextile is in January of 2026 at 27 Pisces and Taurus. And so that to me really feels like reckoning with the way things have been and seeing if this is how we want them to be moving forward, particularly around like tech and government structures. And
Yeah.
Aries can like bring in like war and conflict, and whether that's like a literal war, which is possible, especially
Likely.
the last 3 times that Uranus was in Gemini were like World War II, the Civil War, and the Revolutionary War. And then
And
Saturn and Neptune and
Neptune,
Aries is
yeah,
like
Neptune and Aries also has been in
idealizing
war.
war. Yeah, and that what Neptune was in Aries during the Civil War last time. But also like wars are fought on many fronts, and so like it might be like bring out your bazookas, but it might also be like these like kind of tech wars, or like behind the
Yeah.
scenes, or like wars on the like floor of Congress as well, but conflict for
Especially
sure.
Right, especially because Google launched Gemini, their version of AI, which was one of the first ones, I believe, right when Jupiter moved into Gemini. And that was the
Interesting.
trine with Pluto at the very beginning of that ingress. And so that's something I've been thinking about a lot too, is like now that Jupiter just left Gemini, but Uranus is moving in, if that's going to like take everything that was just expanded and like kind of create a different home or different space for it.
Yeah.
And especially because Google is now about to have its Saturn return and it's
Hmm.
coinciding with this AI movement. And the outer planets are in, the other outer planets are in air signs, which rules over communication and the movement
And
of AI
technology.
and technology. And yeah,
Yeah.
those things feel like they're all gonna come together. And I've already noticed, and I've been talking about this for a long time too, but Pluto moving into Aquarius to me has always felt like people almost turning on celebrity culture
Hmm.
and starting to fall in love with everyday people on the internet,
Hmm.
and almost like idealizing regular people. And so the people that are getting famous are just like TikTok stars or like people who are just like on YouTube and things like that.
Hmm.
And there's almost been this like collective turning against actual celebrities or people who
Hmm.
got famous in very different ways in the
Like a
past.
disillusionment with that for sure.
Exactly. And like,
Um,
people leaning towards the everyday person is very Aquarius.
totally. And then also with Uranus moving into Gemini, like Uranus is associated with the Prometheus myth, who was the god who
Right.
stole fire from the gods and gave it to man. And so
Right.
it's like Uranus and Gemini could potentially be power to the people of, I mean, because this technology, like, it's in the hands of
Mhm.
a few creepy billionaires, but like there's so much potential. Like if we could use Amazon's distribution system to make sure everyone had food and medicine, like
Yeah.
amazing, you know? And so I'm not saying we're going to have this like utopic ending, but having the technological advancements that have been happening be like stolen and given to the people, and made more available as like a form of power for us could be one way that Uranus and Gemini plays out.
Right.
And also, just like Prometheus was punished very, very
Right.
harshly for doing that, having
Right.
his liver eaten by an eagle every day. So
Yeah.
it's like the people who are fighting for this and like the revolutionaries fighting for like power to the people are like taking significant risks, and also like very appreciated that you are doing this work to like
Yeah.
try to claim the future for us, because that's the thing, is there's these huge shifts
Yeah.
that are happening with all the outer planets, and we know that the powers that be do definitely love to use crisis to like reconsolidate and solidify power for themselves,
Mhm.
but there's not a guarantee of how it'll shake out. And sometimes like Austin
Right.
Coppock, who I just keep quoting today, does
Yeah.
talk about how like the last three times Uranus was in Gemini were all really major existential crises and like wars and extreme difficult times in American history. But at the end of all three of those conflicts, things looked better than they did before
Right.
for average
Very
people.
necessary. And I also think a lot about how the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction brought an increase of food pricing.
Because it was in
Because
Taurus.
it was in Taurus. And so there was like this huge like push of everything all of a sudden costing so much more. And I feel like ever since then we've been seeing this like changing of everything. And then Jupiter and Gemini brought so much like misinformation. And so now Jupiter and Cancer is going to be like, okay, well, now what, right? Like, because it's first of all, it's so weird that every single planet is moving this year, including all of the outers. And then it's
Yeah.
so weird that all of the outers are moving into masculine signs except for Jupiter. Jupiter's the only
Hmm.
one kind of like staying in that feminine space. And and it's exalted. So it's interesting to think that there's going to be points within the next few years where Jupiter's maybe the only, well, in the next year, Jupiter's the only feminine planet. And when it moves into Leo, what's that going to look like? And so
Hmm.
that could be really interesting too, is just like the speed that we're starting to feel
Hmm.
has already taken off. And the masculine signs are all about movement. They're all about speed. They're all about like
Hmm.
action and just going after things, whereas the feminine are a little more passive or reflective. And so we're not giving any time for reflection. We're just moving. We're just like
Hmm.
running straight into it. And I feel like everyone I've talked to recently has been talking about how this past 6 months have felt like 6 years, but also have gone by so fast at the same
Yeah.
time. And that's how I feel about it. It's just like so much has happened, but it also
Hmm.
flew by. And so there's this very weird double, double energy to it.
Totally. And I mean, it would be interesting at some point to do a whole episode on like masculine and feminine signs and the
Yeah, I
utility of
would love
using that
to.
language. Because
Right.
we are both trained in Hellenistic astrology, and that's a way they talk about it. And
Mhm.
also, the Hellenistic era was an incredibly misogynistic, like
That's true too.
sexist, horrifying time. So it's like examining what we inherit from that.
Hmm.
But I also like, and then masculine and feminine mean different things to everyone, and they've become so charged now in conversations. And I really like, I'll think of those signs as diurnal versus nocturnal. Like the air signs and
Yeah.
fire signs are the masculine, they're daytime. Like air and fire move upwards and outwards, they're like more
Mhm.
external elements. They move faster. And then the nocturnal feminine signs are water and earth, and like earth compresses and holds things, and if you pour water on earth it goes inwards, and so they're a bit slower moving and more internal. So many roads lead to Rome. There's different ways to make sense of that, but definitely having all the outers and these like fast extroverted signs is like very
It's
overstimulating.
so much, yeah.
Which maybe now would be a good time to talk about some like herbal support for
Yeah.
burnout.
I had one more thing I wanted
Example?
to,
Oh
yeah.
yeah, share that.
Yeah. Um, well, actually two more, but this one's really short. I found this weird correlation with the last time Saturn was in Aries, so in the 90s, and people being obsessed with clothing that were just one piece. And I have noticed that that's kind of coming back.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, so like overalls were a big thing, or like one piece bathing suits were a big thing, or just like onesies in general. Had like a huge trend in the late 90s, and maybe that coincides. But the
Everyone
important
go
thing
get
I
a
wanted to
onesie.
mention, yeah, right. Yes, that's the unimportant thing I wanted to talk about. The more important one that I've been thinking a lot about is gun control and the
Hmm.
topic of violence in America, especially, but like all over the world, obviously. And so I was popping around the internet trying to see if there's been correlation with Saturn and Aries in the past and how that's shown up in in history because we are starting to see just so much of it exploding right now. And I was like, I wonder if, Aries would rule guns. I wonder if there's going to be a restriction to guns or if that's ever happened. And I actually did find some really interesting things. So Saturn and Aries could feel like a restriction placed on personal autonomy. And so
Hmm.
just like watching out for things like that. But the FBI was actually created originally during a Sun-Saturn conjunction in Aries, and there was also a Mars-Uranus conjunction in Capricorn at the same time that was squaring it almost exactly. And so this was in 1908 when the FBI was created. And so um, that felt pretty relevant to all of this. And I've noticed in history there's been a lot of gun legislation in general. The Gun Control Act happened in 1968, which once again was also a Saturn and Aries
Mm.
movement. Um, and then in the 90s, I also noticed that a lot of other countries started to ban guns and
Mm.
especially specific kinds. And Australia, like we were talking about, banned guns in the like in 98, I believe, is what I read.
Yeah, I
Um,
think, I mean, if we have any Australian listeners, please like comment and give us more context if you know. But I think that was like they had a really, really tragic mass shooting event where their response
yeah,
was to then like kind of recall all the guns.
yeah,
And it would be interesting to see what rates of gun violence are there now. And Lori and I are not, we're
yeah,
not like making statements on what it, I
yeah,
mean, I
absolutely
want to
not.
see less violence. But there's many ways to commit violence beyond having a gun. I'm also thinking just like increase in terrorism in general, being a
Right.
Saturn and Aries, like Aries activations in general. And I'm thinking of like how much people love driving cars into crowds now as well. So there's just a lot of like really scary manifestations of violence that can come through with harsh Aries activations like Saturn
Yeah,
and Aries.
of course. But because Saturn rules restriction, I actually think this
Restricting the
could
guns, yes.
exactly. I
Yeah.
think this could actually be a really incredible transit for us because there has been so much violence
Hmm.
recently that I do wonder if, it might get worse before it gets better, but I do wonder if by the end of this Saturn and Aries transit, if we as well, we being Americans, like finally do ban guns or start to put restrictions that
Hmm.
should have been there in the first place, or if those themes of violence actually do start to get punished more so.
Yeah, if we find
Um,
like solutions to minimizing the violence
yeah,
that actually minimize it, that would be
yeah,
amazing.
that
Um,
would be. Yeah, because I have found like there has been in history just so much of that
like it's shown up. Yeah,
shown up,
that makes
and
sense.
people like trying to at least be accountable for it. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I think about.
No, that's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then some herbal support for burnout. Like I was already sharing, like just assessing your capacity and not like pushing too much or overdoing it, and actually giving yourself time for rest and stillness. Especially, Saturn loves stillness. Saturn and Aries might not, but like Saturn likes things that are slow and still. Um, Beyond that, like other ways to get rest besides, I mean, even just going to bed 15 minutes early or staying in bed 15 minutes longer, like little bits like that can help.
Mm.
Acupuncture can put you in a place of deep rest for a short period of time. Meditation, deep breathing, massage, taking baths, like these are ways to like give yourself a lot of rest in a short period of time, which I feel like a lot of us don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
um, Making sure that you are getting meaningful physical activity, like to get the excess adrenaline and cortisol out of your system.
Yeah.
And
Have you
then just
also
like,
noticed, just sorry to interrupt, but real quick, have you noticed those Japanese head spas like popping up
no,
everywhere?
that's cool. That's
Because
super
that's very
Aries.
Aries.
Hmm.
Yeah, because I was like, oh yeah, like massages, definitely. But yeah, there's been this trend of Japanese, I think they're Japanese head spas where like you get your hair massaged and they like your
Hmm.
hair and like there's this thing that goes through and like they give you like a full head massage and I think it comes with a facial. So like that's very funny that like focusing on
Yeah,
that has become a self-care thing during
I
all
love
this.
that. I love
Yeah.
that.
Yeah,
Go to a
continue.
Japanese head spa. That's no,
Right.
that's
I was like,
great.
wait a minute, that's funny.
That's so literal.
Yeah.
And then as far as herbs, just like a disclaimer that I am not like licensed in any way. Herbalists are not licensed in the United States. The FDA has not evaluated any of my claims. Always like work with a licensed medical provider to make sure that things are safe for you to take. And if you ever take an herb and it doesn't feel good in your body, stop taking it. I'm just sharing some educational information for you to do your own research about. But adaptogenic herbs are really good for the adrenals. They work specifically on helping kind of restore and balance out adrenal function, which benefits all of our hormonal functions. Adaptogens are best when they're taken daily over an extended period of time, and they help our bodies better respond to stress. My
Mhm.
favorite adaptogen is ashwagandha because a lot of adaptogens can be really stimulating, and ashwagandha is a little more calming. And I think most of us need a bit more help coming down rather than up. Um, Another one that can be really great is Eleuthero. You don't want to take Eleuthero for more than a few months at a time, and you want to be able to give yourself a lot of rest around it because like if you're in a time like you're, finishing grad school or something where you just like need to be giving more than you have, Eleuthero can increase your stamina. It's a great herb for athletes as well for this reason, and it can help you just deal with intensity and have the energy to get through things. I also used it. I was like super burnt out from recovering from surgery last year, Saturn, and like Eleuthero is what got my like energy. Like when you're just like low grade burnt out and you cannot get back out of it, like even if you are sleeping a bunch, like Eleuthero can bring you back up. But it can allow you to overdraw even more from your adrenals and lead to an extreme burnout. So it's not
Yeah.
a replacement for rest, but it can be helpful in acute situations. I prefer tincture in the morning every day. Rhodiola is also a really good adaptogen. Reishi, Tulsi. There's tons of info about adaptogens out there, but they can help your adrenals. But you still need to rest. You can't just have a magic pill that allows you to do everything.
Yeah.
And then also just taking care of your nervous system, like skullcap and milky oats both feed your nervous system and restore frayed nerves.
Mhm.
Lemon balm and Tulsi are really good, like daytime You can drink them at night too, but they don't really make you sleepy, but they're still like calming herbs. And then like mugwort, blue vervain, kava kava, catnip. There's a lot of really good sleep herbs as well. So really like, disconnecting from screens a little bit, putting your feet in the earth, tending to yourself to like bring yourself back down from all the Aries stimulation. But if you're feeling really activated, and like stillness is gonna like be too much for you, that's when like going out and moving and getting some meaningful exercise, getting some sunlight. The sun's exalted in Aries, so literally just connecting with the sun can be helpful. A lot of these are kind of just like basic self-care, but it's really hard for us to find the time and prioritization of like actually caring for ourselves. And
Right.
so I'm just your friendly neighborhood herbalist, encouraging you to choose like one to two of these things. Don't try them all, unless you want to, but don't overwhelm yourself trying to become less overwhelmed. And
That
just
sounds
like,
like an Aries thing to do.
and yeah, but just really watch out for burnout in whatever way makes sense for you, because I really feel like a lot of us will be experiencing some pretty acute burnout at different points in Saturn's time in Aries.
Yeah. And like I have worried about it getting really hot and like
Yes.
the sun getting hotter and stuff too, because it was like that last year. And so like not being able to spend as much time outside could be a reality we face too. So
Yeah, also like paying for the
enjoy it
consequences
now.
of our actions is a very Saturnian thing, and like climate change is
Very
here.
Aries.
Like it's hot, it's smoky, get air purifiers for your house. I live in Oregon and we've like never needed air conditioning before and we're starting to need it. So be prepared, climate change is definitely here. So like fires and heat waves, and what do you need to survive that actually,
Especially
because they're
Saturn and
they're
Aries. We're gonna see that in the
deadly. And
news.
like how can we help others, how can we help unhoused folks and elders and infants and those who are like really vulnerable to wildfire smoke and heat. That's
Yes.
the Jupiter and Cancer of like us all taking care of each other while we go through this
Yeah.
dystopian climate change time.
Yeah. And that's interesting you say that too, because Uranus moving into Gemini. Gemini rules the lungs. So I
Yeah,
wonder if there is going to be some sort of
I'm
thing.
terrified about air quality moving forward. um, get air purifiers for
Yeah.
sure. Okay, and then Saturn and Neptune. I mean, there's so many astrologers out there who have done a lot of really good work, and we're just giving some like kind of high level things to consider. But for like the Saturn Neptune conjunction has been building since March of 2023, when Saturn moved into Pisces and became co-present with Neptune, which had been in Pisces since 2011. Neptune just moved into Aries on March 30th, and it will retrograde back into Pisces this fall. I don't have the exact date. And then next year, both Saturn and Neptune will be like into Aries for good. For like Neptune will be in Aries for 14 years. It's a long transit.
Right.
But so this has been energy that's been building, and now they're like basically on top of each other. Um, they will both be at 1 degree of Aries in August of 2025, and then they will have one exact conjunction that perfects in February of 2026. And so that's kind of the timeline for the Saturn Neptune in conjunction. But Saturn brings structure and longevity and stability, and Neptune dissolves things and connects us with like the oneness of all that is and makes us really dreamy and foggy. So that's where Lori was saying earlier, a lot of people, especially with Aries placements, feeling like lethargic and foggy, that, further adds to the burnout conversation that we've been talking about. But Neptune kind of makes you want to disconnect from reality and just go be in this daydreamy place. And so it's Neptune and Saturn are very incongruent energies. They're doing very different things.
Yeah.
But it can be the dissolving of structures. Like one of the like most famous examples of the last time Saturn and Neptune conjoined in 1989 was the fall of the Berlin Wall. So it can
Mm.
be the fall of existing structures, which goes back to the prepping stuff of like, don't be like a crazy, prepper who gets a bunch of beans and lets them rot, but like, what would you do if certain structures that you've counted on were no longer there? Would you be ready for that? It can lead to like the disillusionment of existing structures. Neptune can also bring up like in Aries can bring up like an idealism of war, like really thinking that going to war is going to be this like beautiful heroic thing. Aries is very much like the hero's journey energy. And then you end up home in a body bag, and it's like not actually the dream you thought of, right? But like increase in war and like warlike fever can be a thing with this conjunction as well. What are you seeing with the Saturn Neptune conjunction?
Yeah, I mean, mostly that, mostly those things. Um, Saturn and Neptune both being there, I have wondered what is going to crumble and what is going to be torn down, especially with the other outers being in air signs, especially with Pluto and Aquarius, because Aquarius ultimately just wants what's best for community and collective. And
Hmm.
Aries,
And not what's best for leaders. It's opposite Leo, right? So it's
correct.
like taking the power, like the assassination of the healthcare CEO is very like Pluto and Aquarius.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I do wonder if we are going to see a lot more of that until it starts becoming a little bit more even or equal.
Yeah. Or like, the French Revolution was Pluto and Aquarius, and that was like
Right. The
guillotine. I wonder,
Industrial
I wonder
Revolution.
if Saturn and was in Aries at any, I mean, it would have been in Aries probably at some point with the last Pluto and Aquarius. But
Yeah.
anyway, sorry, keep going.
Yeah, well, and the Industrial Revolution and all of that. So like I do think we are going to see a lot of themes of people fighting back. People, even on a day-to-day personal scale, you might start seeing people who maybe have just been pushed aside for a long time starting to fight back.
Hmm.
You might see
Labor
them at your
movements.
jobs. Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
like agricultural uprisings. Those are very Saturnian things.
Yeah, yeah. And like I I've been thinking a lot about how food has like really become almost like unedible. And
Yeah,
like
it's
I
literally
don't
poison,
it is. And I don't eat
especially in
out
the United
much.
States.
Right, exactly. I don't eat out much, period, but I really only do when I travel. And a lot of my more recent trips in the past year or two have been out of the country. And so it's been interesting. Recently, I've like just been so busy that I've been occasionally picking up food or like we were just in Seattle for Norwalk. Like I've been eating out more in the States and I've just been feeling like, ugh, like I remember this used to be good or like Chipotle has
Yeah,
gotten
like the
so
quality of
like
stuff.
the
Yeah.
quality of things are
Hmm.
just like different and it was
Or
like this thing
even
that
not
did so
food
well.
things, like pillows.
Yeah,
Like I
that
got
too.
like pillows with my mattress in 2021 that were really good, and then my partner bought the same mattress last year, and the pillows they sent are crap. Like just the quality of stuff has gone down.
Quality of everything has gone down because the expenses have gone up. And so
Yeah.
to keep expenses down, I think the tariffs probably have a lot to do with this too, but
Yeah,
we're
we'll
just
probably
seeing
see this even more. Yeah.
exactly. We're starting to see just like such a change in quality. And the guy who bought the shop, I'm still the reader there, so I was talking to him on Saturday, and he was saying that there was just a huge increase of price of the um, from the main website he orders from. And he was just saying like, I don't know if I should switch, or he just started talking about some concerns he has, and I was like, yeah, it's gonna get harder and harder to order anything anywhere off of besides Amazon, I guess. Like besides the
Yeah.
places who have the amount of money to be able to sustain not having to rise the prices so much.
Yeah, because
Um,
Amazon's model is literally to just charge under market value and drive out all their competition because they actually make their money
exactly.
from their data services. So,
Right.
but
Right.
then when we need to just like afford basic things, like what do? We like kind of have to use it, right? So,
Exactly. And so it is going to, I think, burst
yeah, the
probably.
bubble that Aries is sharp, like it's gonna pop some bubbles for sure. But Neptune might make the bubble and then it gets popped. Yeah. And then
Yeah.
also just like Neptune and Aries, like in your personal life, like where are you idealizing the hero's journey, particularly around the Aries part of your birth chart? You might be feeling some more like fantasy idealization. There's a warning with like rose-colored glasses or not being able to see things clearly, but Neptune can also feel really good.
Yeah.
But I mean, yeah, it's like Saturn wants to see things clearly, and Neptune's like a big fog that rolls in. So it's kind of hard to sort those energies out. And then like especially people with like early Aries placements, like I feel like Lori, you're such a good example of now you have this extra motivation where you've been working on your book a lot because Saturn's moved into Aries and sped things up and brought more energy. But then like you could lead yourself to burnout, or you have been feeling more tired as well because Neptune's also on top of your moon. So it's just like, how do you balance these opposing
Yeah.
energies?
Well, and Neptune too. I've actually been talking a lot about this. I've almost been questioning certain things or like having these moments of like, I would really like this in a book, but would other people? And like,
Mm-hmm.
there's almost
It's
this
like
like
not clear.
illusion.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not usually one who does that. Usually I'm like, this is how I feel like
Well,
writing
because
it, so this is
Aries
how
is
I'm gonna write it.
decisive. Aries is so
Exactly.
decisive, and Neptune
Right.
is not.
Right. And I've been
Yeah.
finding myself just being, because it is, it is my 10th house and it does rule my 8th house where I have my Saturn and everything else. And so it's just been this big conversation of, is this what I want? Like, is this the right way to do it? And
Mm-hmm.
like, since when do I care about the right way to do something?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been something I've been noticing, like, wow, if I'm questioning things, I wonder how other people are feeling about these
Yeah.
things.
That's where astrology is just so helpful to give us context, like knowing the weather you're walking through. Like, if it is a heat wave, you do not want a winter coat on, right? And it's like
Right.
symbolically, if we don't know what astro weather we're walking through, then how are we supposed to meet the conditions? And that's
Right.
like the fate versus free will thing of like, you have a lot more free will to meet your fate if you know what your fate is, right? And
Right.
that's where astrology comes in.
Yeah. And it was super helpful too, like when I started to feel a little bit off and like was wondering if I had some sort of infection in my nose, because I could see that Saturn was 2 degrees from my moon, I was like, okay, I'm gonna take this seriously and I'm gonna just go to the
Hmm.
clinic. I'm just gonna go get
Yeah.
it checked out. Whereas if Saturn wasn't there, or if like Mars wasn't there, I probably would have just written it off as nothing.
Hmm. But
But I
Saturn
got
on
it
your
checked
moon, like,
out.
deal with your body. Like,
Exactly,
yeah,
right.
yeah,
So
yeah.
I was like, oh, because of the transits, I'm actually going to listen and take it seriously.
Hmm.
And the doctor was like, yeah, like it's good that you did that. It's not really anything, but here's a medication you can take for 5 days and then it'll go away. And it
Yeah,
did. It was super easy.
good.
But it was like, oh, like this is just like a, hey, pay attention to me.
Hmm.
But it also really made me slow down and I had to skip a bunch of things that week that I had planned. And it like forced me to rest again.
Hmm. Great. Well, I feel like this was a nice, long, thorough
Yeah,
episode, as
we had a lot to
Saturn would
say.
demand.
Yes.
If anyone
Yep,
has
so
any
we
like
have.
questions or personal examples they want to share, like please comment down below, reach out to us
Yeah.
on Instagram. We love hearing personal stories. Lori and I both are, practicing astrologers who offer readings, and our links are down below. So if you like really want to dig into this more personally with what it really means for you and how you can work with this energy, please reach out. And then we will be recording an episode more about specifically like just Saturn returns in general. So tune in for that. And yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any personal stories to share or thoughts and reflections about what we discussed in this episode, please comment down below or reach out to us on Instagram. And please come follow us on Instagram at ConversationsWPlanets, where we share forecasts and updates about the astrological movements happening in the sky, as well as updates about our episodes. The link to our Instagram is in the show notes down below.